Under the dim haze of a Macedonian dawn, long before history anointed him as Alexander the Great, he was simply a boy with a spoon and a bowl of existential despair, otherwise known as breakfast. Forget the myths for a moment. Strip away the armor, the conquests, the melodramatic statuary, and what you get is a teenager forced to eat hot barley mush, while being reminded that moderation was a virtue and flavor was a slippery slope toward decadence. Before empire, there was porridge, and it came unsalted. Young Alexander's days began in a chill so sharp it could shave ambitions. The sun was nowhere to be found. Neither was Aristotle, who presumably wasn't a morning person. But the kitchen, if you could call it that, was already alive. Pots boiling, servants muttering, and the slow, relentless bubbling of boiled barley that clung to the pot like resignation. This was gruel. Not just any gruel, but noble gruel. Slightly salted, occasionally enriched with goat's milk, if the gods were in a good mood, and served with the kind of reverence usually reserved for punishment. It was thick, greyish, and morally opposed to pleasure. Welcome to the first conquest of the day, surviving breakfast without crying. The bread that accompanied this warm sorrow was not the fluffy, yeast-kissed kind found in artisan bakeries with ironic names. Number. This was war bread, probably made from emmer or barley flour, flat, dense, and textured like a philosophical argument. You didn't bite it, you negotiated with it. It had edges, it had opinions. It was bread that remembered grievances and offered none of its secrets easily. This was not accidental. Philip II, Alexander's father, a man more comfortable on the battlefield than at a birthday party, believed in a particular kind of upbringing, Spartan but Macedonian, harsh, lean, and deliberately deprived. His idea of luxury was survival, and so Alexander was not given golden spoons or honeyed cakes. He was given calories and a fatherly scowl. Even the cheese, when present, was a challenge. Goat cheese, aged to the point of defiance, with an aroma that could start a rebellion. It wasn't served to delight, it was served to strengthen. If your sinuses weren't cleared by its mere presence, you weren't ready for empire. And then, of course, there was wine. Yes, even for children. But before you picture toddler Alexander sipping Shiraz while composing odes to conquest, know this. Macedonian wine for youth was mostly water with a suspiciously purple tint. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as barbaric, or poetic, which in Macedon was pretty much the same insult. This breakfast, in all its minimalist agony, was a training ground. It taught you not to expect sweetness, not to seek excess, that to rule others, you must first defeat your appetite. Every bite was a lesson in control, every swallow a rehearsal for command. It's worth remembering that while most children learned their letters on wax tablets, Alexander was likely being quizzed on dietary philosophies between spoonfuls of mush. What did Pythagoras say about beans? Are figs decadent or spiritually neutral? Which foods lead to gluttony and which just to sadness? This was how Macedon raised its rulers, not with indulgence, but with culinary indifference and an atmosphere of restrained despair. The morning meal, though humble, was political. It signaled the values of the court: discipline, austerity, suspicion of anything soft. Because in a palace where one day you might be ambushed, poisoned, or forced to marry strategically before dessert, softness was a liability. And so, young Alexander learned to eat not with pleasure, but with purpose. The food didn't comfort, it prepared. Boiled barley was not merely sustenance, it was a metaphor. You eat what is given, you endure what is necessary, you keep chewing, even if the flavor never arrives. This breakfast table was not a family gathering, it was a proving ground. The servants knew it, the tutors knew it, even the goats probably knew it. If Alexander asked for honey, he likely received a speech about moral decay. If he looked at a second portion, he got a nod from a nearby philosopher whose job it was to make him feel bad about wanting seconds. It worked. By the time he was old enough to lift a sword, He had already mastered the art of denying himself everything except ambition. And when he eventually dined in Babylon, surrounded by gold and perfumed meats, he still craved the chew of barley and the brine of olives, not because he loved them, but because they reminded him who he was before the world bowed. This wasn't nostalgia, this was discipline weaponized. So when we talk about the rise of Alexander the Great, we usually start with his father's military reforms, Aristotle's teachings, or the battles of Granicus and Gaugamela. But really, it started here, with porridge, in a cold room, before sunrise, chewed slowly under the watchful gaze of men who believed that softness killed empires. It's not glamorous. There's no dramatic music or horse-mounted triumph. Just a teenage boy, a wooden bowl, and the quiet understanding that everything you eat, or refuse to eat, shapes what kind of ruler you become. In the grand architecture of destiny, breakfast was the foundation, a cold, mushy, mildly humiliating foundation, but a foundation nonetheless. And that, more than any crown or prophecy, is how conquest begins, one reluctant spoonful at a time. Lunch, for most people, is a break in the day, a moment to sit, chew, digest, maybe think about anything other than duty, empire, or ontology. But for young Alexander of Macedon, lunch was just another lecture, a philosophical seminar disguised as a meal, where the menu was guilt, legumes, and life lessons delivered by a man with more opinions than seasoning. His tutor, of course, was Aristotle. You know, Aristotle, Plato's student, logic's spokesperson, and professional fun sponge. While other boys were arguing over who got the bigger chunk of cheese, Alexander was being asked whether indulgence was a slippery slope toward tyranny. Spoiler, it was. Lunch with Aristotle was not relaxing. It was strategic character development served lukewarm, with a side of moral pressure. Imagine trying to eat while being reminded that each bite said something about your soul. You take an extra olive, and suddenly you're being accused of inviting decadence into your spirit. That's what it meant to grow up in the intellectual minefield of Macedon. The food wasn't bad because they couldn't afford better. It was bad on purpose. The worse it tasted, the more virtuous it made you. That was the entire point. According to the logic of ancient virtue, flavor was weakness in disguise. Lentils, those endlessly mushy little orbs of culinary mediocrity, were a staple of the midday meal. Why? Because they were simple, filling, and symbolic of restraint. A philosopher's legume, no sharp spices, no elaborate preparation, just boiled disappointment in a bowl. It's unclear whether Alexander actually enjoyed lentils. Probably not, but enjoyment wasn't part of the lesson plan. The goal was detachment from pleasure, and lentils, in that regard, were ideal. You didn't eat them because you liked them. You ate them because they made you slightly miserable in a productive way. That was moral fiber, literally and figuratively. Aristotle's lunchroom wasn't just a dining space. It was a dojo of discipline. Between bites, he would discuss the nature of the good, the balance of temperance, and probably the political implications of over-salting your stew. A second helping was not just overeating. It was a philosophical lapse. Meals were moments of testing. If Alexander so much as reached for another wedge of goat cheese, he would likely be met with a raised eyebrow and a casual reminder that gluttony dulled the soul and thickened the wits. At that age, most kids are still learning how to not spill their drink. Alexander was learning which legumes aligned with ethical governance. No pressure. It's worth noting that Aristotle didn't just preach moderation. He embodied it, painfully so. He viewed food as a necessity, not an event. For him, lunch was a carefully balanced equation of bodily maintenance. Too much, and you became decadent. Too little, and you became weak. Just enough lentils, and maybe you'd rule an empire without collapsing from either starvation or moral collapse. The food was a metaphor. The dining table, a battleground. If Alexander hesitated before eating something too sweet, that hesitation was the goal. It meant the training was working, that he was learning to question not just what he consumed, but why. Would this fruit nourish the body or corrupt the will? Was honey a treat or a threat? These were not rhetorical questions. They were literal lunch discussions. Philosophers in the ancient world didn't believe in letting you enjoy your food in peace. Every bite was a referendum on your character. In that context, lunch became a form of moral conditioning, a method of turning appetite into accountability. It's no wonder Alexander grew up to be suspicious of comfort. When your adolescence is spent having legumes psychoanalyzed, luxury loses its appeal. The real irony, of course, is that this wasn't just about food. It was about empire. Every meal was a preparation for leadership. Because what is leadership? In Aristotle's view, if not the ability to say no to excess, even when excess is served on a golden plate by a trembling eunuch. Alexander learned to endure hunger. He learned to chew without complaint. He learned to treat meals as necessary burdens, not pleasures. This was not an accident. It was Aristotelian social engineering, one spoonful of mashed beans at a time. And it worked. Years later, while Persian nobles reclined on silk cushions and bit into honeyed duck glazed with pomegranate syrup, Alexander was still chewing on barley bread like it was his duty. And in a way, it was. He'd been conditioned not just to lead men, but to outlast temptation. That meant rejecting not only foreign luxuries, but also the internal voice that asked, could we just have one bite of something enjoyable? That voice was the enemy, and it had been silenced years ago by a philosopher with a cold gaze and a hot bowl of lentils. Even water wasn't safe. Aristotle had thoughts on hydration too. Pure wine was barbaric. Overly flavored drinks distracted from clarity. So, Alexander learned to sip diluted wine. Barely wine at all, really, because it was civilized and morally neutral. Everything had meaning. Everything was symbolic. A fruit wasn't just a fruit. It was a moral test in disguise. Lunch wasn't lunch. It was a rehearsal for future greatness. And so, while most teenagers navigated acne and awkward silences, Alexander navigated ethical dialectics over bean stew. This wasn't childhood. It was a prelude to conquest, drafted in crumbs and condiments. The idea was that if you could master the plate, you could master yourself. And if you could master yourself, you could master others. This is the kind of logic that leads to world domination and digestive regularity. Did Alexander resent it? Possibly. Did he understand it? Absolutely. Because even as a boy, he knew that greatness didn't come from comfort. It came from control. And if control had a flavor, it tasted like lentils. He carried that lesson with him. Across deserts, into battlefields, through banquet halls, and into legend. The man who refused a second serving was the same man who refused to rest until the map bowed before him. So the next time you see a statue of Alexander, don't just admire the pose or the horse. Think about the lunch. Think about the quiet discipline, the unimpressed philosopher across the table, the bowl of warm greyish mush that tasted like moral calculus. That was where the empire started. Not on the battlefield, but at the lunch table, under the silent scrutiny of a man who believed that leadership could be boiled, salted, and served with a lesson. And if you're wondering what victory tastes like, it's probably just cold lentils reheated over an open flame, with a side of philosophical disappointment. Because when your teacher is Aristotle, and your destiny is empire, lunch is never just lunch. It's judgment, disguised as a meal. If you were to peek inside the average Macedonian lunchbox around the 4th century BCE, you'd likely recoil, weep softly, and then marvel at the fact that anyone managed to conquer anything on so little joy. This was not a lunchbox in the modern sense. No insulated containers, no proportioned snacks, no lovingly scrawled notes from a doting parent. The Macedonian lunchbox was a burlap pouch of hard edges, questionable odors, and deeply militarized calories. It contained not sustenance, but a survival strategy. Bread, of course, was the backbone of the meal. Not soft, fluffy bread, not the kind that sings when torn or melts when buttered. This bread had character. It had chew resistance. Made from barley or emmer wheat, it was dense, flat, and spiritually opposed to delight. If you could break it with your hands, you were probably doing something wrong. Macedonian bread was known to chip teeth and test friendships. It came in slabs, not slices. It was bread you had to earn the right to chew. Bread that doubled as a weapon in a pinch or a building material if morale collapsed. It did not forgive, it did not forget, and it absolutely did not rise. This was bread with a grudge. To pair with this edible cinder block, Macedonians included cheese, not the creamy, meltable kind. This cheese had been aged to the point of self-defense. Usually made from goat's milk, it was briny, firm, and capable of clearing your sinuses from across the battlefield. It was the kind of cheese that fought back. If you didn't slice it with a dagger, it sliced you. It traveled well because nothing wanted to get close to it, including bacteria. Macedonian goat cheese did not spoil. It threatened, and it added protein to an otherwise aggressively fibrous dining experience. Beside the bread and cheese might sit a few olives. Again, not the kind marinated in herbs and lemon zest. These were bitter, briny, unrepentant olives. They came from trees that grew out of rocks and tasted like generational trauma. Eating them was less about pleasure and more about proving that you could. They were oily, harsh, and shaped like regrets. But they were rich in electrolytes and gave you just enough salt to shout military slogans without passing out. Sometimes, if the stars aligned and no one had been raided that week, there would be dried fruit, usually figs or dates, but not the kind that looked appetizing. These fruits were chewy, sticky, and existed somewhere between food and furniture. They were ancient dessert, not sweet enough to enjoy, but sweet enough to remember what joy once felt like. They stuck to your teeth and reminded you of the fragility of dental health before fluoride. They were functional sugar units wrapped in the texture of historical burden. For protein, the Macedonian soldier might get meat, if you could call it that. Salted, dried, and cured within an inch of its former life. The meat was usually goat or beef, occasionally boar if someone had recently offended the locals. It was not juicy, it was not tender, it was meat that dared you to choke on it and win. It was thinly sliced, sun-dried, and salted until it had the consistency of ambition left out in the wind. You didn't bite this meat. You negotiated with it over several minutes, often soaking it in wine or water to make it chewable. It was protein with an attitude problem. For hydration, you had two options. Option 1, diluted wine. This was essentially red-tinted water, made acceptable by the cultural consensus that drinking pure water was dangerous, and drinking pure wine was barbaric. The wine was usually so watered down that it felt like your tongue was remembering a better drink. But it was safe, at least relatively, and didn't taste like moldy leather. Option 2, actual water. This was rare and deeply suspicious. Water came from flasks made of animal skins or leather, meaning it often tasted like a wet goat had whispered its secrets into your cup. It was lukewarm, murky, and unsettling, but it kept you alive, assuming it didn't kill you first. Ancient filtration systems were mostly hope and prayer. Despite its humble, hostile contents, the Macedonian lunchbox served a strategic function. It was portable, resilient, and emotionally indifferent. It provided energy without comfort. It didn't lull you into complacency. It reminded you, with every bite, that you were mortal, and the desert didn't care. It kept your body functioning, and your soul slightly irritated, an ideal state for conquest. And then there was the psychological element. Alexander the Great, despite having access to far superior meals as a royal, often ate the same rations as his soldiers, not out of necessity, but out of principle. He believed no man should eat better than the men he led. So while his conquered enemies dined on jeweled stews and perfumed lamb, Alexander sat in the dirt, broke his teeth on barley bread, and chewed like he was trying to set an example with his jaw. It worked. His soldiers respected him not just for his military genius, but for his digestive solidarity. If your king is eating meat that tastes like salted parchment, You feel strangely motivated. Leadership, in Macedon, was not about crowns or feasts. It was about chewing the same misery as everyone else and pretending you liked it. This egalitarian approach to suffering made Alexander not just a general, but a symbol. The lunchbox, then, was more than a meal. It was a message. It said, "We do not require luxury. We are not weakened by absence. We carry our sustenance like we carry our weapons, with practicality and quiet fury." The food didn't need to be good. It needed to survive the journey, feed the body, and fuel the march. And it needed to taste just bad enough to keep everyone slightly angry. Hunger makes a poor soldier, but comfort makes a worse one. There was no room in the Macedonian diet for softness. No pudding, no garnish, just salt, muscle, and resolve. Food was a tool, not a pleasure. A ration, not a right. You ate to function. You functioned to conquer. And you conquered so that one day, maybe, you could afford a better fig. The irony is that even when better food became available, many soldiers stuck to the old meals. Simplicity became identity. Hard bread became loyalty. Goat cheese became tradition. The lunchbox outlived the battlefield. Because once you've built an empire fueled by rations that could double as masonry, it's hard to go back to luxury without feeling like you're cheating. So yes, the Macedonian lunchbox was brutal, but so was the empire it fed. And in the end, maybe the two were inseparable. Bread, cheese, and discipline. That's what built a world. One bite at a time. Dinner with your father is rarely a stress-free event, even if your father is not a one-eyed warlord with a drinking habit and 7 wives. Unfortunately for Alexander, his father was exactly that. King Philip II of Macedon, military strategist, political opportunist, serial husband, and the kind of man who thought emotional intimacy was best expressed through battle formations. Dinner at the royal table was not about food. It was about power, optics, and who could survive the meal without being insulted, exiled, or accidentally engaged to someone from Thessaly. The food itself wasn't bad by Macedonian standards. In fact, it was probably the most edible meal of the day. Roasted lamb, stews thick with lentils, grain pilafs, flatbreads warmed by fire, and jugs of wine that ranged in strength from polite buzz to historical regret. It was hearty fare designed to keep a war machine running. Not luxurious, but certainly filling. Unfortunately, it came with a side of volatile political theatre and absolutely no safe conversational topics. Picture a long wooden table. At one end sits Philip, flushed from wine and victory, flanked by generals who smell like horses and ambition. At the other end, a teenage Alexander, quietly calculating how not to trigger an international incident before dessert. Between them, poets declaim verses no one asked for, philosophers debate the ethics of taxation, and somewhere in the middle, someone is definitely lying about troop numbers. This was not a family meal. This was a military council in disguise, where roasted meat was served with passive-aggressive toast, and the wine never stopped flowing unless it had been thrown across the room. Philip drank heavily. This is not a historical slander. Even ancient biographers, who were paid to be polite, described him as enthusiastic about his wine. And while it takes a certain kind of charisma to conquer Greece, it takes an entirely different kind to do it while visibly intoxicated. Philip had both. Unfortunately, charisma mixed with alcohol makes for unpredictable parenting. One evening, after enough wine to embalm a small army, Philip insulted Alexander in front of the court. Something about legitimacy, something else about succession. Alexander, not known for his patience, left the table, not politely, not quietly. He stormed out like a future emperor and left behind the smell of scorched lamb and damaged pride. It was a defining moment, not just because it revealed the cracks in their relationship, but because it highlighted the fact that dinner in Macedon was less about bonding and more about psychological warfare with cutlery. Even when things were calm, the atmosphere buzzed with strategic silence. Who was seated closest to the king? Who got the largest portion of meat? who dared make a joke and who dared laugh. Every motion at the table was a move in a larger game, and Alexander watched. He always watched. He learned how influence worked, how words could cut deeper than spears, how one poorly timed toast could derail a marriage alliance or spark a rebellion. He learned not just from Philip's lectures, but from Philip's mistakes. For every victory the old king toasted, there was a lesson, in restraint unspoken but noted. Alexander drank, but sparingly. Not because he didn't like wine. He was Macedonian, not a monk, but because he had seen what happened when wine mixed with statecraft, and because he knew that in a world ruled by perception, clarity was power. You don't conquer Asia by slurring through negotiations. Occasionally, Philip would bring exotic foods to the table, honeyed pastries from Thebes, fish from the Aegean, strange herbs from distant provinces. These were not culinary experiments, they were trophies, edible proof of influence. Alexander would try them, out of politeness or curiosity, but he always returned to the basics: bread, meat, wine, diluted to the point of symbolism. He wasn't interested in peacocking. He was interested in empire. The emotional landscape of these dinners was as dry as the wine was not. Philip was both mentor and rival, protector and obstacle. To Alexander, he was a model to surpass, not emulate. Their interactions were laced with admiration, tension, and a deeply unspoken competition. Every bite chewed under his father's gaze was a reminder of what he would one day have to surpass. And so Alexander learned to eat defensively, to speak strategically, to endure the mood swings of a man who could hug you one moment and plot a marriage for you the next. He learned when to smile, when to listen, and when to walk away. These dinners weren't just meals, they were rehearsals. Rehearsals for diplomacy, for command, for betrayal. You don't learn to rule an empire in the classroom. You learn it between mouthfuls of lamb, while watching your father negotiate the balance of power, with nothing but a goblet and a raised eyebrow. The servants knew to tread lightly. The generals knew to nod wisely. And Alexander knew that dinner was never just dinner. It was a battlefield in slow motion. There was always someone testing you, watching you, waiting for you to show weakness or appetite or anything that could be turned into gossip by morning. That is why Alexander rarely indulged, not just because he had discipline, but because he had learned that too much pleasure attracted too many eyes. He didn't want to be memorable at the table. He wanted to be unshakable. And so, while others lounged and laughed, Alexander sat straight, chewed slowly, and mentally drafted maps of places he would one day conquer. It was not a joyful experience, but it was educational. In that sense, dinner with Philip was a masterclass in control. Control over words, over emotion, over the urge to stab someone with a carving knife. Control, even when insulted. Especially when insulted. It's no surprise then that Alexander would later apply this training on a global scale, that he would eat with kings and warlords and never lose his composure, that he would refuse luxury even when swimming in it, that he would treat food as performance, as message, as moral statement, because he had learned early that the table is where power is tested, that meat is never just meat, that wine is never just wine, that your father's laughter can carry the weight of judgment, and that your silence can be the loudest answer. So the next time you think of ancient Macedon, don't imagine thundering hooves or gleaming helmets. Imagine a teenage boy, seated beside a man whose footsteps shook the region, quietly eating lamb and thinking, one day, I will do it better, not because he hated his father, but because he had dinner with him, regularly, and survived. That, in Macedon, was its own conquest. On the road, food stops being food and becomes fuel, tactical calories, portable nutrition with the personality of sand. When Alexander and his army marched, through deserts, over mountains, across rivers that barely qualified as water, and into cities that didn't know they were about to become historical footnotes, they did not dine. They rationed, they chewed, they endured. What they consumed could barely be called a meal. It was more of a texture experience punctuated by survival. The standard ration consisted of three main components: bread, meat, and dust. The bread, as always, was baked days or weeks in advance, hardened into slabs that could double as makeshift armor or emotional reminders that comfort had been deliberately left behind in Macedon. These loaves were portable, dense, and approximately as edible as sandstone. They did not mold because no living organism wanted to be associated with them. Soldiers would often dip the bread in diluted wine or stale water to soften it into something marginally chewable. It didn't work, but tradition demanded the gesture. The meat was salted, cured, and committed to resisting digestion. Usually goat or beef, sliced thin, dried under sun and judgment. It offered protein with the texture of political ambition, hard to swallow, and destined to return in uncomfortable ways. The salt content could preserve the flesh of the dead for weeks, which was convenient because that's roughly how long it took to finish a single piece. Chewing became a meditative act, or a punishment, or both. Vegetables were a fantasy. Fruit, if present, was dried beyond recognition and packed tightly into cloth to be rationed like precious metals. One fig could be passed around like a diplomatic token. Everyone allowed one solemn bite before returning to the more familiar flavors of sweat, leather, and despair. Sometimes they foraged. Wild onions, garlic, roots, berries. If it didn't look poisonous or taste like betrayal, it was probably edible. Culinary standards dropped with every mile. By the time they reached Central Asia, it's likely some of the soldiers began to hallucinate about boiled lentils and goats that seasoned themselves. There were no meals on the march. There were only interruptions in marching. You stopped, sat in the dirt, unwrapped your portion, and stared at it like it owed you something. Then you ate quickly, not because it tasted good, but because flies exist and time is a luxury. Cooking fires were risky, smoke revealed position, and wood was scarce. So most food was eaten cold, raw, or previously tortured into an unrecognizable shelf-stable form. The only consistent seasoning was dust. It was everywhere. It clung to your hands, your bread, your meat, your face, and your memories. It flavored everything, with the subtle despair of a life lived outdoors with no plan B. The army moved with brutal efficiency, which meant meals were strategic and disposable. The lighter the food, the better. Fat content mattered only if it wouldn't melt. Carbs mattered if they didn't crumble. Protein mattered if it didn't require explanation. No sauces, no garnish, no culinary experiments. This was not a picnic. This was the deliberate starvation of expectation. The flasks used for water or wine were made of leather, which meant everything tasted faintly of cow. Water, assuming it existed, came from rivers, streams, or suspicious puddles. Purification was handled by hope and gastrointestinal roulette. Wine, diluted to the point of symbolic intoxication, was often preferred, not for pleasure, but because it was slightly less dangerous than optimism. The body adjusted, or it didn't. Diarrhea was common, malnutrition inevitable, dental decay expected. Yet somehow, they marched. Thousands of men, sustained by hardened carbs and mental fortitude, crossed continents with the digestive consistency of a goat and the culinary boredom of a prison camp. Alexander, to his credit, rarely ate better than his men. He took pride in chewing the same fiber bricks and meat bark. It wasn't a performance. It was a statement. If the king could eat this nonsense and still conquer Persia, you could too. Discipline wasn't just on the battlefield. It was on the plate, or in the sack, or in whatever container held your daily intake of chewable humility. These rations did something strange to the psyche. They simplified things. There were no menus, no preferences, no allergies. Just food and not food. You either ate it or you didn't. Hunger sorted priorities. Complaints were optional but frowned upon. Food became ritualized, a shared experience of suffering, a bonding agent more effective than speeches. Soldiers might not remember the battles, but they remembered the meals they didn't have. And when they did eat, they remembered the silence, the collective chewing, The mutual agreement to pretend that what they were swallowing was nourishment and not just compressed anxiety. As the campaign dragged on, some attempts at variety emerged. Local ingredients were incorporated when possible. Rice in India, new herbs in Bactria. But even then, the essence of the ration remained unchanged, functional, forgettable, and absolutely unworthy of poetry. There were no famous chefs in Alexander's army, no secret recipes, just the grim acknowledgement that food was a tool and luxury was for the conquered. Occasionally, animals were slaughtered en route. These moments felt almost festive, not because of the meat, but because it was warm, fresh, and reminded everyone that food could once again have a temperature other than ambient dust. But even these moments were fleeting. The meat was cooked quickly, shared unevenly, and followed by days of scarcity that made the memory seem cruel in retrospect. Salt was hoarded, oil was rationed, fire was sacred, and cutlery was optional. Hands did most of the work, hands that also held swords, dug trenches, and buried friends. Hands that were not washed regularly. Flavor, if it existed at all, was an accident. The most consistent taste was fatigue. Meals were not eaten for pleasure, but for momentum. A soldier who chewed was a soldier who moved, and a soldier who moved was a soldier who conquered. That was the logic. Brutal, efficient, depressing. But it worked. In the end, the rations on the road weren't just calories. They were proof that humans could adapt to almost anything. That you didn't need silk cushions or honeyed lamb to take over the world. That sometimes all it takes is bread like roof tile, meat like history, and enough dust to season your dreams. Because conquest isn't fueled by feasts. It's powered by crumbs, grit, and the kind of hunger that turns tactical discomfort into territorial gain. And if you think that sounds unappetizing, congratulations. You understand ancient military logistics. Bon appétit. In the long catalogue of uncomfortable leadership moments, few are as enduring or as parched as the infamous helmet of water. Picture the scene. Alexander the Great, deep in some desert that looked like it had lost a bet with geography, surrounded by tired men who had run out of adjectives for hot, dry, and unfair. Their lips were cracked, their sandals were melting, their goats had given up. And somewhere in the midst of this human dehydrated mess, a scout returned with something precious. Not news of reinforcements, not word of victory, just water, a little of it, enough to fill a helmet, which in normal times would have held sweat, blood, and possibly regret, but now contained a shimmering liquid miracle. The soldier's eyes locked onto it, hope rehydrated. The scout, with ceremonial solemnity, brought the water to Alexander. He offered it like an artifact, a reward, a desperate gesture that said, "Please, for the love of Olympus, drink this, and maybe we will too." Alexander took the helmet, stared at it, and did what no one in their right or left mind would have done. He poured it into the sand, all of it. No dramatic sip, no speech about how leadership means sacrifice. Just a silent cascade of water vanishing into the ground, soaked up by earth that hadn't felt moisture since the last ice age. It was either a genius move or a war crime, depending on your hydration level. This act was not impulsive. It was calculated, because Alexander understood the dark science of morale. He knew that if he drank, and they watched, unity would fracture like a dried fig underfoot. But if he poured it out, they would remember. Not the thirst, but the message. That he didn't eat better than them. That he didn't drink while they suffered. That if they were miserable, so was he, on purpose. In ancient warfare, that was leadership by deprivation, and Alexander majored in it. He had no interest in being comfortable. Comfort was weakness with cushions. His army didn't follow him because he paid well or hosted good banquets. They followed him because he endured the same humiliations they did, and made them feel like those humiliations meant something. Like pouring out perfectly good water into dying soil because optics mattered more than electrolytes. It wasn't the first time he did something like this. Alexander made a habit of shared suffering. When soldiers walked, he walked. When they bled, He bled. When they itched, he probably itched harder just to prove a point. There were no royal litters, no perfumed palanquins, no separate feast for the chosen. Only a king with calloused feet and dehydrated pride, chewing on stale bread next to the same guy who hadn't bathed since Egypt. His leadership wasn't philosophical, it was physical. It was visible. It was cruel in the way that inspired loyalty and rashes. The helmet of water became legend, not because of the water, but because of what it denied. It denied privilege. It denied comfort. It denied the instinct to say yes to yourself when everyone else is starving for a no. Alexander's greatest speeches were often silent. They were performed, not spoken. And in this case, performed by wasting the one thing that could have made his tongue stick to his throat a little less. That was the moment the soldiers knew. This man was serious. Not in a, here's a 5-minute pep talk kind of way, but in a, let me destroy the one blessing we've had in days just to make a point kind of way. It was manipulative. It was theatrical. It was emotionally devastating. And it was effective. Deprivation was Alexander's second language. He spoke it fluently through cracked lips and sunburnt decisions. Because when everything is terrible, consistency becomes comfort. And nothing is more consistent than a leader who refuses pleasure as a strategic weapon. The psychology of shared misery is not taught in business school, but it should be. It's how you get an army of strangers from different tribes, languages, and tax brackets to move together across unforgiving terrain while somehow believing they are a single body. You don't unify them with rewards. You unify them by erasing the concept of privilege, starting with your own, even if it means you have to fake it occasionally, especially if it means throwing away drinkable water in front of men whose throats sound like sandpaper on a tombstone. People forget that ancient warfare was not about strategy, it was about logistics. And logistics, at their core, are about misery management. If your men believe they're suffering for a reason, they'll keep moving. If they believe you're suffering too, they'll die for you. That's the currency. Not gold, not land, not gods. Misery, shared equally, distributed like bread and water, or, more often, the denial of it. The helmet of water wasn't just an act of denial, it was a dare to the men. If I can do this, so can you. If I can go without, you can go without. If I can pour away salvation, you can shut up and march. It reframed thirst as valor, deprivation as virtue. It made suffering noble. And when you're starving and blistered and hallucinating the face of your mother in a pile of horse dung, nobility is the only seasoning left. This was how Alexander kept control, not by giving more, by giving less. By turning leadership into martyrdom without death, by being just visible enough in his own suffering that others forgot theirs, or at least reframed it as a shared burden instead of a personal complaint. In the modern world, we'd call this toxic resilience. Back then, it was glory. The helmet of water became a symbol, carved into reliefs, whispered in campfire stories, misremembered in poems, and yet it endured. Not because it quenched thirst, but because it proved something more powerful than hydration: discipline. If you can master your thirst, you can master anything, even an empire, especially an empire. The moment was brutal, unforgivable even, but effective. And in the world of Alexander, effectiveness was the only morality. So the next time you feel proud for skipping your afternoon snack, remember this. Somewhere, long ago, a man poured a helmet of water into the desert so that thousands would keep walking into chaos. Not because they were promised comfort, but because they believed that if they kept going, they might one day earn the right to thirst again. Welcome to leadership, Macedonian style. Now, drink up, if you can find anything left. The first time Alexander sat at a Persian banquet, he wasn't thinking about conquest. He was thinking about how not to look impressed. Because nothing shatters a reputation for Spartan self-denial faster than drooling over pomegranate-glazed lamb while being fanned by eunuchs and serenaded by 12 identical harp players. Persian feasts were not meals. They were architectural events built entirely out of food, music, and the faint aroma of imperial smugness. The tables weren't tables. They were terrains of decadence. Gold platters stacked with roast duck, saffron rice, almond pastries, and desserts that sparkled because someone thought edible gemstones were a food group. It wasn't nourishment. It was diplomatic performance art. And Alexander, raised on barley bread and goat cheese, was expected to sit through it without blinking. His army could barely comprehend it. These were men who had been surviving on stale rations and psychological endurance, now staring at fig-stuffed quail arranged in floral spirals by slaves who probably had degrees in presentation aesthetics. It was culinary shock and awe, and it worked. Men began to loosen their belts. They smiled too much. They reclined a little too easily. They stopped remembering what hunger felt like, which, to a military mind like Alexander's, was a red flag soaked in rosewater and wrapped in velvet. Temptation, he understood, was not a sin. It was a strategy. These banquets weren't just hospitality. They were tests. Subtle, delicious traps designed to pacify the conqueror and convert the invader into a connoisseur. The Persians knew how to weaponize comfort. Feed your enemy like a god, and maybe he'll forget he came to dethrone one. Alexander didn't forget. He saw the silk cushions, the honey-glazed distractions, and the quiet smile of the satrap who hoped Macedonian discipline would collapse under a mountain of fruit compote. So he smiled back, took a polite bite, and began crafting a new form of resistance. Tactical restraint served cold. He never fully embraced Persian luxury. He sampled it, approached it like a battlefield, observed the terrain, measure the threat, control the appetite. He dressed like them occasionally, yes, but not because he was seduced. It was camouflage, psychological diplomacy. He knew his men watched him, and he knew they were afraid he'd gone soft. So he played both sides, publicly respectful, privately suspicious. He might attend the banquet, but he never gave in to it. He didn't gorge, he didn't sprawl. He didn't flirt with dancers or praise the wine with unearned joy. He remained a little hungry, a little stiff, a little annoyed, which was exactly the right amount of discomfort to maintain control. Persian cuisine, to be clear, was exquisite. These were people who had perfected the art of culinary seduction. They understood spice layering, texture contrast, and how to turn dinner into a 6-hour mood shift. They invented dessert long before it became necessary. Their stews had names longer than treaties. Their rice could bring tears to your eyes. But Alexander had not marched across continents to be impressed. He had marched to dominate, and he understood that domination required boundaries, even at the buffet. The true danger of Persian feasts wasn't indigestion. It was assimilation, the slow erosion of edge. Because once you recline, you stop advancing. Once you dine like a king, you start thinking like one, which, ironically, is the last thing an empire builder should do. Kings inherit, conquerors march. Alexander kept marching. He allowed the banquets, but never let them define him. When his officers grew too fond of the delicacies, he reminded them, often harshly, that this wasn't retirement. This was occupation, and occupation requires vigilance, not syrup. Even his eating habits became messages. He ate less than those around him, drank more water than wine, chose rough bread over jeweled cakes. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy the food. He just understood the consequences of enjoying it too much. Pleasure had to be rationed like supplies. Too much, and the campaign falters. Too little, and morale dies. The balance had to be exact. He became a curator of austerity, not because he hated joy, but because he feared what came after it. Complacency. His discipline was never accidental. It was strategic. Persian feasts became a battlefield of the mind, a test of cultural digestion. Could he consume without being consumed? Could he honor their traditions without abandoning his own? Could he taste victory without forgetting hunger? The answer, mostly, was yes. Except for the rare occasion when he did indulge, usually to make a point. Because sometimes power is eating the entire roasted peacock while looking a local king in the eye. But those moments were calculated exceptions, not habits. The average day returned to frugal meals, dry commentary, and suspicious glances at anything too delicious. Even luxury was turned into discipline. The banquets also revealed a key philosophical divide, where the Persians believed in the visibility of power, showing strength through opulence. Alexander believed in the invisibility of control. Strength for him was not in excess but in restraint, not in what you flaunted, but in what you withheld. It's why he remained unpredictable, why he could dress in silk but still sleep in the dirt, why his men, despite their doubts, kept following him, because he never let a golden goblet distract him from the next map. And the food? It became background noise, decorative evidence of conquest, a reminder that just because you've reached the banquet doesn't mean the war is over. In fact, it's usually just getting started. So, Alexander dined, sparingly, strategically, like a man who knew the difference between appetite and addiction. Persian feasts were not his downfall, they were his test, and he passed, not by rejecting the food, but by refusing to become the kind of man who needed it. And that, in the end, is how you conquer a feast. By surviving it with your hunger intact. Imagine sitting down to dinner in a palace that once belonged to the man you just chased across half a continent. The walls are still polished with his ambition, the halls still echo his footsteps, and the gold plates on the table were forged with his signature and his taxes. This was the situation Alexander found himself in after taking over the lavish dining quarters of Darius III, the last king of the Achaemenid Empire. It wasn't just a meal, it was psychological warfare with cutlery. Darius was gone, fled into the wind like a tax collector behind on his rounds, but his presence lingered, not in person, but in fabric, marble, protocol, and the fact that every single fork was worth more than an average soldier's yearly pay. The Persians didn't do subtle. Their dining philosophy was to overwhelm your senses until you forgot your political grievances. Gold plated everything, perfumed tablecloths, napkins embroidered with myths, stews so fragrant they could start negotiations, bowls filled with pomegranates, dates, nuts, and enough saffron to financially ruin a small island. Every dish was a statement, every bite a distraction. Alexander understood this. He sat there, surrounded by the spoils of a defeated empire, and didn't blink, because eating in Darius's dining room wasn't about food. It was about asserting ownership, not just of land, but of legacy. It was about sitting where the king sat, using his plates, drinking his wine, and pretending not to notice the cold stares of servants who had not yet decided if they were conquered or just in between masters. The mood was tense, not celebratory. This was not a victory feast. It was an audit. Every surface was still Persian, the chairs still carved with lions, the carpets still thick with stories. Even the ceiling had more decoration than most temples. The atmosphere smelled like roses, cinnamon, and recent trauma. Alexander, raised in Macedonian austerity, approached this culinary museum like an anthropologist with a knife. He didn't reject the luxury outright. That would be rude. He partook, modestly. He sampled the wines, tasted the lamb, acknowledged the mastery of the rice dishes that somehow managed to be both fluffy and aggressive, but he did so with detachment, calculated neutrality, like a man dining inside the memory of a rival, because that's exactly what he was doing. Darius may have been absent, but his shadow was served at every course. The irony is that Alexander didn't hate Darius. He didn't even know him. They never met, but he knew the idea of him, the myth, the legacy, the logistics of an empire that operated like a luxury brand with a military. And while Alexander was busy conquering territory, he was also conquering aesthetics. The Persian Empire had perfected the art of political dining. Everything on the table had diplomatic weight. Even the fruit arrangements communicated hierarchy. So when Alexander took that seat, He wasn't just eating, he was digesting power. His generals were less restrained. Some of them dove into the abundance like men who had never seen anything other than barley porridge. They marveled at the sweetness, the spices, the infinite sources, and Alexander watched, not with jealousy, but with calculation, because he knew that for some, this meal was the beginning of decline. That comfort had a price. That chewing too slowly in another man's palace could make you forget your own. He made mental notes. Who reached for the gold goblets first? Who leaned too far into the cushions? Who laughed too loudly? These were not innocent acts. They were symptoms. And Alexander, ever the diagnostician of ambition, catalogued them with the precision of a surgeon. The food was extraordinary. That much is undeniable. Persian chefs had elevated cooking to divine theatre. They combined sweet and savoury with an audacity only empires can afford. Lamb with apricots, eggplant in mint yogurt, honey-glazed carrots with cinnamon and cumin, and desserts that looked like architecture and tasted like policy. But Alexander didn't come for the cuisine. He came to replace the man who used to. Every bite he took was a reminder to himself and everyone watching. This belongs to me now, but I will not belong to it. He even adopted some of the Persian customs, not out of affection, but out of practicality, wearing the robes, honoring the etiquette, speaking through interpreters with polished phrases, not because he wanted to be Persian, but because he understood that to rule an empire, you have to look like you're part of it, even while you're rebuilding it from the inside. Darius's seat became a symbol, his cutlery, ceremonial, his dining room, a political stage, and Alexander, still hungry from miles of conquest, used it all without ever appearing satisfied. He wasn't there for comfort, he was there for continuity. The cold eyes weren't just from the servants, they were from history itself, watching him, judging him, whispering in the smell of roasted dates. Are you worthy of this? Do you know how to inherit an empire without becoming embalmed by its softness? Do you know how to eat delicately while still planning your next war? Alexander answered with silence. And more rice, because real power doesn't chew loudly. It digests everything, legacies, territories, and expectations, without choking. Dining in Darius's shadow wasn't about enjoying a meal. It was about metabolizing an empire, and Alexander, as always, finished his plate, slowly, strategically, without ever asking for seconds. Dining in someone else's palace is awkward enough without the added pressure of knowing the last occupant died running from you. This was the ambience Alexander inherited when he sat to dine in the regal halls of Darius III, the final Persian king whose empire had boasted a culinary tradition as lavish as its bureaucracy was bloated. It wasn't just a change of decor, it was a change of ownership, political, cultural, and digestive. The gold plates remained. So did the heavy rugs that silenced even the loudest sandals. The columns still gleamed with imperial overcompensation, and the ceilings looked like they had been carved by a team of artists, working exclusively in the medium of existential pressure. But Darius himself had exited the stage, and Alexander had entered, bringing with him the baggage of conquest and a lingering suspicion that everything was poisoned, metaphorically or otherwise. The feast, of course, was unavoidable. Persians didn't do subtle transitions of power, they did sensory overload. So Alexander found himself seated in a room designed to impress gods, surrounded by officials who weren't sure if they were guests or hostages, and served by attendants whose faces said everything their mouths couldn't. The dishes arrived in waves, each more baroque than the last. Spiced stews thick with history, rice so delicately fluffed it felt like betrayal to swallow, fruit glistening in syrup that probably had a 10-step preparation process involving poetry and mild torture. But the centerpiece was always the silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of performance. Every movement, every gesture, every bite, a calculated reenactment of the imperial order that had just collapsed like a pastry under too much garnish. Alexander didn't eat like a conqueror. He ate like an anthropologist with blood on his hands. He understood that the real challenge wasn't defeating Darius on the battlefield. That part had already been done with dramatic flair and logistical nightmares. The real challenge was occupying Darius's chair without becoming Darius. And nothing symbolizes cultural assimilation faster than licking the last drop of honeyed lamb off a gold spoon while lounging in imported cushions. So, Alexander did what any strategic narcissist would do. He restrained himself. He sampled. He nodded politely. He complimented the saffron without asking for more. It wasn't that he lacked appetite. It's that he understood the semiotics of appetite. Excess consumption is a declaration. So is refusal. And Alexander, being both conqueror and curator, walked the tightrope between indulgence and rejection with the poise of a man who had studied under Aristotle and marched through deserts. He was, after all, not just dining in a palace. He was dining in a ghost. The ghost of Persian absolutism, of imperial splendor, of authority expressed through tableware. The gold plates were not just plates. They were policy. The table itself was a throne. Every fork was a treaty. Every napkin folded by a slave with generational trauma. The food was seasoned with legacy. And legacy, Alexander knew, was both seductive and fatal. His generals, of course, were less philosophical. Many of them dove into the feast like prisoners granted temporary amnesty. They piled their plates high with unfamiliar delicacies, drank like they were trying to forget what marching felt like, and laughed too loudly in a room that still reeked of protocol. Alexander noticed. He always noticed. He didn't scold them, not directly. But his glance across the table, cool, measured, edged with disapproval, was enough to remind them that empires aren't maintained with stuffed cheeks. Luxury wasn't just dangerous. It was contagious. And Alexander, already juggling the optics of blending Macedonian grit with Persian spectacle, couldn't afford for his court to look like it had joined the enemy through desert. The real power play wasn't on the battlefield. It was at the table. It was in eating less, not more, in choosing the coarse bread over the delicate pastry, in sipping watered wine while others gorged. Alexander understood that leadership was theatre, and the audience was always watching, especially the Persians, who were testing him with every roasted pheasant and fig-stuffed delight. Would he embrace their customs, their food, their idea of kingship, which involved less warfare and more reclining? The answer was always a qualified maybe. He wore the robes. Sometimes. He observed the rituals, publicly, but he never allowed himself to disappear into them. His identity was a balancing act, half barbarian, half enlightened despot. He needed to appear tolerant without appearing converted, because the moment he belonged at that table was the moment he lost the mandate to break it. Even the servants, whose expressions had been trained into polite unreadability, were watching, not out of affection, but curiosity. Who was this sunburnt foreigner who sat where the King of Kings once sat? Would he honor their culinary empire or trample it under the heel of military rationing? Alexander's answer was typically strategic. He would neither worship nor desecrate. He would appropriate selectively, digest symbolically. He would eat just enough to claim the table, but never enough to enjoy it. The difference was everything. The palace's grandeur didn't move him. He had seen enough opulence to know it was often just compensatory architecture. What interested him was how power had been layered into every spoonful, every spice, every empty gesture of hospitality. Darius had ruled by overwhelming presence. Alexander would rule by contrast, stillness, austerity, myth. One used feasts, the other used silence. The tension was palpable. Every course served not just food but questions. Would he continue the Persian tax systems? Would he marry into their nobility? Would he drink from the ceremonial cup reserved for the true ruler? He did some of these things. Others he left deliberately ambiguous, because power thrives in ambiguity, and nothing confuses an empire more than a leader who refuses to define himself through their categories. The food, in all its glory, became a footnote. A shimmering, fragrant, culturally saturated footnote. It was a necessary part of the performance, but not the star. Alexander's true feast was psychological. He was consuming the empire from within, fork by fork, gesture by gesture, not to become Persian, but to ensure that Persia became his, not through destruction, through digestion. And that is why the gold plates mattered, not because they held food, but because they held meaning. To eat from them and remain unchanged was the true victory. The cold eyes that watched him, those of advisors, generals, former courtiers, weren't judging his manners. They were searching for weakness, looking to see if the new king could handle the weight of old rituals. Alexander didn't flinch. He ate quietly, chewed deliberately, kept his posture rigid and his mind sharp, because in this palace, relaxation was surrender, and he hadn't crossed the known world to recline. So when the feast ended, when the last pomegranate seed had been dissected, and the final goblet drained of symbolic wine, Alexander rose from the table without looking back. He had conquered the meal the same way he conquered the territory, with detachment, discipline, and a lingering aftertaste of inevitability. Dining in Darius's shadow wasn't about food. It was about inhabiting a legacy without suffocating inside it. It was about asserting authority not with noise, but with the quiet refusal to be impressed. And in that silence, sharper than any dagger, Alexander reminded everyone that gold plates are just metal until someone stronger picks them up. India was not on the menu, at least not in the conventional sense. For Alexander and his increasingly bewildered army, India was supposed to be the epilogue, one last curtain call of conquest, a place to tie the narrative together, with elephants, exotic maps, and perhaps one final speech about unity before dying dramatically in Babylon. Instead, India served something different, a sudden, steaming, aggressively seasoned challenge to everything they thought they understood about food, war, and gastrointestinal equilibrium. Up until this point, Alexander had eaten his way through empires with the steady rhythm of a man who knew what boiled barley tasted like and wasn't impressed by variation. Persian banquets? Check. Egyptian ritual offerings? Check. Macedonian rations that could also function as building materials? Double check. But India was not here to be digested politely. It was here to burn. Everything. Including the tongue, the ego, and occasionally the latrine. The first problem was the curry. Not because it was offensive, but because it was alive. It defied classification. It wasn't a flavor.it. It was a military campaign waged against the palate, composed of an alliance between chilies, turmeric, mustard seed, and something unidentifiable that might have been divine, or might have been a tactical warning. Macedonians, untrained in the art of spice, responded as one might expect, with suspicion, sweat, and involuntary prayer. They had fought battles in swamps, deserts, and mountains, but nothing prepared them for a source that lingered longer than imperial treaties. Some historians believe that spice was India's first and most effective line of defense. It wasn't designed to repel armies.it, was designed to remind them they didn't belong here. You could conquer cities, sure, but you couldn't conquer cumin without consequences. And Alexander, despite his usual steel nerve detachment, was not immune. He approached the cuisine like he approached elephants, fascinated, cautious, and mildly betrayed. Because just as the elephants disrupted his military formations with their sheer unreasonableness, the food disrupted the chain of command at mealtime. Soldiers who once survived on dried figs and flatbread were now negotiating with lentils that seemed to bite back. Tactical digestion became a daily exercise. Who could handle the spiced chickpeas without hallucinating? Who vomited with dignity? Who, in a moment of weakness, asked for milk and was never respected again? Meals turned into skirmishes. The kitchen, once a safe space for sustenance, became a psychological gauntlet. And yet, Alexander did not retreat. He adapted, slowly, the same way he adapted to cultural clothing, administrative reforms, and the occasional assassination attempt. He didn't reject Indian cuisine. He studied it, respected it, approached it not with Macedonian arrogance but with imperial curiosity. He sampled, learned the names of the spices, even consulted with cooks whose ancestors had seasoned royalty long before Macedonia learned to boil water properly. This was how he always operated. Observe, imitate, absorb, dominate not through brute force, but through integration. But even he knew there were limits. His men, hardened veterans of 1,000 marches, were beginning to crack, not from war, but from diarrhea. The tropical climate didn't help, nor did the psychological strain of fighting people who not only didn't fear them, but who rode elephants and fired arrows from painted towers while shouting in unfamiliar languages and offering food that smelled like philosophical debates. The curry, in this context, was more than a meal. It was a mirror. It forced Alexander to confront the absurdity of his campaign, the sheer audacity of dragging an entire army beyond the known world, only to discover that the universe still didn't care who you were if you couldn't handle cardamom. The food demanded humility. It reminded them that their palate was not the center of civilization. That taste was subjective, and suffering could come in the form of perfectly cooked eggplant. And yet, in this culinary disorientation, there was insight, because India's food was an extension of its strategy, layered, complex, ancient, and absolutely uncompromising. You couldn't eat around it. You had to engage. And engagement meant digestion, tactical digestion, not just of food, but of ideas, customs, sensory overload. You had to learn to sweat and smile at the same time, to cry over curry and still plan your next ambush, to recognize that conquest was not just about land.it, was about stomachs. Alexander's approach evolved. He began to balance local food with imported rations, blending familiarity with adaptation. He created new rules for meals, limiting spice exposure before battles, and introducing a concept that would centuries later be recognized as spice fatigue. His personal meals became metaphors, half Macedonian, half Indian, wholly unstable. But that was the point. Stability was a lie. Empire was flux. You had to embrace the burn. Meanwhile, the elephants watched. Always the elephants. Towering, judgmental, perpetually unimpressed by human theatrics. They were the true critics. You could measure a commander's worth by how well his digestive system held under pressure, but you measured a general's future by whether he could maneuver around elephants that didn't care about your cavalry. Indian cuisine and Indian warfare shared this in common. They both required recalibration. Alexander never fully cracked the code, but he respected the language. He came to see food not as a distraction but as terrain. Every region brought new flavors, new resistance, new metaphors. A land of mangoes and mustard was not to be underestimated. The curry became a symbol of adaptation, exhaustion, and survival. You could chew through the heat or let it chew through you. Those who adapted marched. Those who didn't squatted. And so the army advanced, slowly, spicily, against rivers, jungles, and intestinal resistance. Every meal became a risk assessment, every bite a moral dilemma. But through it all, Alexander kept moving, because for him, the path to empire ran not just through swords and maps, but through digestion, tactical digestion, controlled suffering in pursuit of a larger narrative. To lead men through foreign territory, you had to lead them through foreign cuisine. And to do that, you had to pretend the burning in your throat was glory. India taught Alexander many things. That elephants don't negotiate. That jungles are political. That flavor is power. But perhaps most importantly, it taught him that even the greatest conquerors must, at some point, face the curry curveball and decide whether they will spit it out or learn to savor it. He chose the latter. Because Alexander never surrendered to the unfamiliar, he devoured it, carefully, with cold eyes, and just enough yogurt on the side. Alexander the Great conquered the known world on a diet that, at its philosophical core, could be summed up with a single legume, the lentil. Not because lentils are glamorous, they are not. They are brown, or sometimes greenish, or vaguely orange when crushed by optimists. But the lentil persisted, boiled, overcooked, and aggressively bland, because it encapsulated something empires spend centuries trying to articulate: control, humility, and the slow, unflinching grind of power maintenance. This was not lost on Alexander. For a man surrounded by incense, gold, wine, and flattery, the lentil was a whisper of brutal simplicity, a reminder that underneath the robes and the rhetoric, ruling still required a functioning digestive system and a tolerance for repetition. The lentil doctrine, as it could be called by historians with too much time and not enough shame, was never written down, but it was lived. It was lived in the barracks, on the marches, and occasionally at banquets where the lentils showed up uninvited, looking like a mistake and tasting like political endurance. Philosophers, those unpaid PR managers of antiquity, loved lentils. Diogenes allegedly lived off them. Pythagoreans swore by them until they didn't. Socrates probably ate them, while pretending not to care what people thought. Aristotle, who spent more time thinking about the nature of thought than actually chewing, would have appreciated their efficiency. Protein, fiber, and moral restraint, all in one unphotogenic spoonful. Alexander, who was tutored by Aristotle and then promptly ignored half of what he said, internalized this ethos without the smugness. To him, lentils weren't sacred. They were structural. A lentil didn't care how royal you were. It softened in water, accepted salt without complaint, and reminded everyone at the table that glory is fleeting, but lunch is non-negotiable. The mushy texture was not a flaw, it was a metaphor, for the way ideals dissolve under heat, for how identity loses sharpness when exposed to long campaigns, long speeches, and longer nights wondering if you're still a hero, or just a tired man with a sword and a stomachache. Lentils travel well. They don't spoil quickly. They don't require ritual. They don't seduce. They sustain. And that made them dangerous. Not to the body, but to the illusion that empires are built on passion. They're not. They're built on infrastructure. Supply lines, predictable meals, digestive neutrality, the kind of sustenance that keeps soldiers moving without inspiring poetry. Alexander's men didn't sing about lentils. They ate them because they had to. Because you can't conquer without calories, and you can't always afford the calories that come with ceremony. Lentils became the placeholder for ambition that had outpaced indulgence. And still, they persisted, quietly occupying space on plates between the glamour of roasted meats and the fatigue of flatbread. They were the middle ground, the compromise, the edible shrug of imperial cuisine. The lentil, when consumed over long periods, reshapes expectation. It tells you, this is what power actually feels like. Not sharp, not spicy, just there, filling, soft, inevitable. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't lead to revolts or festivals. No one writes an ode to a lentil, but no one forgets it either. Because when the feast is over, when the conquest is done, when the speeches grow stale, and the wounds are being counted, the lentil is still in the pot, still simmering, still providing. This is what made it strategic. It was food as policy, a dietary philosophy of restraint. Alexander understood that indulgence corrodes, that too many pomegranates weaken the will, that satiety kills vision. The lentil kept him grounded, not by inspiration, but by contrast. It was the taste of sobriety, of remembering that even the son of Zeus needs bowel regularity. There's no faster way to humility than a bowl of tepid, unseasoned lentils. The lentil was also democratic in the worst possible sense. It respected no hierarchy. The general ate it. The soldier ate it. The cook regretted it. It crossed class, language, and ambition like a bureaucrat with a ladle. In India, in Persia, in Egypt, in Macedonia, lentils maintained a cultural invisibility that disguised their omnipresence. They were never the headline, but they were always the footnote, the quiet scaffolding of military endurance. One could argue that lentils were Alexander's true weapon, not the phalanx, not the cavalry, but the ability to metabolize monotony, to accept the slow burn of blandness and still believe in destiny. While other leaders demanded banquets, he could still function on rations that tasted like boiled decisions. This was not asceticism. This was logistics. You don't reach the edge of the world on flavor. You get there on digestion. Even in Babylon, in the shadow of empires past, lentils made their way onto the table. They outlasted kings. They outlasted dreams. They remained, quietly bloating in their pot, reminding anyone who listened that power is not always loud. Sometimes it simmers, slowly, with legumes. There is, of course, a temptation to romanticize this, to claim that Alexander saw in the lentil a metaphor for the soul. He didn't. He saw food, fuel, a tool, the same way he saw most things. Horses, cities, allies, maps, useful until they weren't, but even he could not fully escape the doctrine, because the lentil, in its squishy defiance, imposes perspective. It tells you you're not special, that empires fall, but flatulence endures, that no matter how far you march, you're still ruled by what you ate 3 hours ago. The mushy philosophy of power is this: it's not about glory, it's about process, sustainability, the boring stuff, the kind of thinking that doesn't look good in murals but keeps people alive. Alexander, the master of dramatics, understood the necessity of boredom, of repetition, of choosing lentils not because they taste good, but because they never betray you. They don't inspire rebellion. They don't cause envy. They just exist, day after day, bowl after bowl. And maybe, just maybe, that's what power really is. Not the gold, not the battles, not the statues, but the quiet endurance of routine. The ability to face the same meal, the same question, the same weight, and keep going. That's the lentil doctrine. And like the legume itself, it's not exciting, but it's always there, sitting in the background, shaping history. One unglamorous, politically neutral spoonful at a time. Victory feasts are where history pretends to smile. After the blood dries, the cities burn, and the bodies are either buried or strategically ignored, someone sets a table. Not out of hunger, but out of obligation. Because empires do not just win, they must also be seen winning. And nothing says victory like overeating in public. Alexander the Great, self-declared unifier of worlds and collector of civilizations, understood this better than anyone. He did not invent the victory feast, but he refined it into a form of imperial performance art, where the meat was symbolic, the seating political, and the wine bottomless, because silence was not an option. A victory feast was never about the food. The food was a prop, lavish, excessive, occasionally edible. The real menu was made of power displays, veiled threats, and carefully calibrated generosity. You invited local nobles to the table not to share culture, but to show them what conquest tasted like. You seated generals by rank, proximity, or impending betrayal. You offered strange new dishes with names no one could pronounce, just to watch who dared try them, and who reached for the bread like a coward. The entire event was a test disguised as a party, and Alexander hosted many. After each major conquest, Tyre, Egypt, Persepolis, there was a banquet. Not always immediately, of course. Sometimes you needed time to clean up the rubble and extinguish the screaming. But eventually, there would be tables, there would be wine, and there would be speeches, each one longer than necessary and shorter than remembered. The food was often excessive, roasted animals that still looked personally offended, platters of fruits arranged into shapes no farmer would recognize, wines from distant provinces, sometimes gifted, sometimes requisitioned, spices so rare they doubled as diplomatic flexes, gold leaf, edible flowers, and sauces that tasted like they were invented by someone with unresolved family issues. The meal was not for nourishment, it was for atmosphere. It was about eating the idea of empire. Every bite was curated, every toast rehearsed. Even the accidents were scripted. Someone would always drink too much, say the wrong thing, and be escorted out with a smile and a future arrest warrant. This was the rhythm of empire. Celebration was just conquest in costume. For Alexander, victory feasts were also tools of assimilation. He used them to blur cultural lines, mixing Persian formality with Macedonian informality, inviting enemies to dine while reminding them who paid for the meal. Sometimes he even dressed in local styles, a move that made traditionalists gag into their lentils, but impressed those who understood that ruling meant adaptation. These were not just meals. They were negotiations served with garnish. The spectacle mattered. Everything had to be seen, commented on, and ideally remembered inaccurately. The size of the tent, the number of courses, the presence of elephants, or dancers, or gold-plated serving boys. The way Alexander entered. Was he on foot, on a throne, or riding a symbolically significant animal? These details were not trivial. They were the subtext of power. Banquets were theatre, and Alexander was always centre stage, holding a cup, giving a nod, letting everyone else pretend for a moment that they weren't terrified of being replaced by someone slightly more decorative. The food itself was surprisingly international. His cooks, dragged along like culinary hostages, had to adapt quickly. One day it was barley and olives. The next, saffron rice and grilled camel. Occasionally, the entire meal would be tailored to the local cuisine as a gesture of inclusion, which mostly meant the conquered got to taste their own culture, served back to them with a Macedonian smirk. Integration through digestion. A win-win, if you squinted. The guests were a mix of victors, victims, and volunteers. Everyone smiled, everyone lied. Some plotted, others despaired. Many drank too fast, hoping to forget they were technically still prisoners. There was music, but no one listened. There were dancers, but the real choreography was in the alliances being reconfigured with every raised goblet. Even the seating arrangements were tactical. Who sat near Alexander? Who was demoted to the edge of the tent? Who was placed just close enough to hear but not respond? These were signals, louder than proclamations. You learned your worth not from titles, but from how hot your food was when it reached you. Occasionally, Alexander would make gestures. He might publicly forgive someone, hand them a gift, speak their name aloud in a flattering tone. This was not kindness. This was policy. Feasts were where you molded memory. Rewrite grievances as misunderstandings. Recast betrayals as misunderstandings. Announce promotions. Hint at retirements. Float rumors like olive oil on soup. It was soft power, dripping with honey and blood. But not everything went smoothly. There were disasters. The most infamous, Persepolis, a victory feast that turned into arson. Depending on which ancient source you believe, Alexander either ordered the burning of the Persian capital while drunk, or watched it happen while pretending to be drunk. Either way, the fire became a metaphor, a meal that ended in flames. History's way of saying, you cannot digest everything you consume. Some things burn. That incident haunted him, not just because it was strategically unwise, but because it proved that even spectacle has limits, that theatrical dominance could tip into self-sabotage. That empire, like alcohol, has a tipping point, and Alexander, for all his control, occasionally tipped. But still, the feasts continued, because they had to, because silence after victory is suspicious, because morale demands illusion, because you can't hand out new titles without offering finger food, and because history demands a party, even when no one feels like celebrating. Alexander eventually stopped attending all of them, not because he lost interest, but because even he couldn't keep up the act forever. The pageantry wore thin, the speeches blurred, the roasted lamb stopped looking impressed. Victory had become routine. The novelty was gone, and in its place, the growing, slow realization that all these banquets were leading nowhere. The empire was expanding faster than it could digest itself, and the feasts were no longer celebration. They were symptoms of exhaustion, of fragmentation, of an emperor who couldn't stop moving, but had nowhere left to go. Victory feasts didn't die. They just became quieter, more symbolic, less remembered. History reduced them to footnotes. A banquet was held. Celebrations ensued. Wine flowed, always the same, until they stopped entirely, because eventually even Alexander ran out of appetite. Not for food, but for pretending the meal still meant anything. He had eaten the world, and it still wasn't enough. Babylon was supposed to be the reward, the grand finale, the imperial exhale at the end of a decade-long sprint through history's most over-decorated sandboxes, but instead it became the setting for a slow, bloated, unraveling disguised as a feast. A city of brick and brilliance where Alexander the Great, world conqueror and part-time philosopher-in-chief, finally sat still long enough for mortality to catch up, and of course it did so at a banquet, because nothing is more fitting than history's most ambitious appetite being brought down at the dinner table, surrounded by sycophants, suspiciously generous cups of wine, and the distant hum of overcompensation echoing off ziggurats, because Babylon was not just a city, it was a trap made of decadence, heat, and unresolved imperial ambition masquerading as hospitality, a place where food was too plentiful, protocol too ceremonial, and every bite felt like both a statement and a warning, which naturally Alexander ignored, because this was a man who had eaten his way across continents and had come to believe, as all tired demigods do, that his digestion was destiny, that his liver would outlast geography, that you could toast eternity on repeat, without consequence. But Babylon had other plans, because Babylon, the city of myths, omens, and regrettable decisions, was where conquerors went to become relics, and so the final feast was less of a celebration and more of a slowly escalating medical event draped in gold and denial. A diplomatic performance where old wounds toasted new ones, and Alexander, bloated with ambition, wine, and possibly a touch of poison or hubris-induced organ failure, gave his last meaningful act not on the battlefield or the throne, but in the ambiguous art of dying publicly without explanation, because that's what this was. A farewell staged as a feast, complete with elaborate dishes no one remembered tasting, foreign dignitaries pretending to understand the conversation, and generals quietly measuring each other's ambitions between mouthfuls of roasted goat and existential dread, because once the great man slumped, the real feeding frenzy would begin, not for food, but for the future, and everyone knew it, even if they kept chewing, nodding, and pretending that the empire had a plan beyond this room, beyond this night, beyond this one man's increasingly labored breathing, because if Alexander had mastered anything, it was the illusion of permanence. And yet there he was, flickering under Babylon's oil lamps, like a dying god, in a city that had seen too many, a ruler who had conquered faster than he could appoint successors, who had built a machine powered by his presence, and forgot to install an off switch that didn't involve mass confusion and 22 claimants to a single funeral, which, by the way, would take 2 years to execute, because even in death, he refused to make things easy. And so the feast at Babylon was a lesson in limits, not culinary ones, but metaphysical. How many provinces can a man eat before something ruptures? How many toasts can be made before the glass cuts back? How much symbolism can a banquet bear before it collapses under the weight of its own foreshadowing? And yet the show went on, as it always does, because empires, like bad habits, prefer routine over reckoning. So the servers served, the dancers danced, and the conqueror sweated through his robes as the wine mixed with destiny and possibly malaria, or typhoid, or revenge, or just the sheer weight of ambition pressing against his insides. And though the sources disagree on the specifics, some say he spoke, others that he simply pointed. One claims he whispered a name, another that he gave his empire to the strongest, which is the diplomatic equivalent of handing a grenade to toddlers. It's agreed that he stopped drinking, not out of choice, but because swallowing became theoretical, and still the feast lingered, an awkward after-party. No one knew how to end, because you can't clap for a dead god without looking desperate, and Babylon, being Babylon, swallowed the moment with typical indifference, filing the greatest death of antiquity under the same category as all its others, inevitable, melodramatic, and unresolved. And so the final feast ended, not with a toast, but with a transfer of silence. A room full of people who had built their lives around a man now quietly deflating in a gold-threaded chair. A silence that would echo for decades in the form of civil wars, splintered kingdoms, and statues no one could agree how to decorate. Because once Alexander died, his feast became a famine, not of food, but of certainty, of leadership, of clarity. And thus Babylon earned its reputation, not just as a jewel of civilization, but as a place where stories go to rot gorgeously, where power dines, declines, and dies under candlelight. And if that sounds dramatic, it's only because history insists on making drama out of indigestion. And in this case, it succeeded, because no matter how you slice the dates, grill the lamb, or spice the wine, the fact remains. The man who never lost a battle lost to whatever was in that final cup. And Babylon, as always, didn't blink. Would Alexander eat this is not just a question. It is a philosophical indictment of our current relationship with food, comfort, and the idea that pleasure and purpose are somehow meant to coexist without conflict. Because if Alexander the Great were dropped into a modern dining scenario, let's say a suburban brunch cafe, with organic signage and an oat milk upsell, he would either laugh, stab someone, or leave in existential despair, not because the food is bad, but because it's pretending not to be food at all, just a lifestyle choice, drizzled with self-validation and chia seeds. And that is the antithesis of the world Alexander came from. A world where meals were tools, not statements, where eating was a logistical act wedged between conquest and digestion, not a 2-hour Instagram meditation on self-worth and roasted beet foam. So the real question isn't, would he eat it, but could he respect it? And the answer is, probably not, because the man who marched across deserts chewing stale cheese would see your artisanal hummus and 3-day juice cleanse as signs of civilizational decline, not innovation, because Alexander didn't need a gluten-free option. He needed calories that didn't kill morale. And he didn't snack to treat himself. He snacked because collapsing mid-campaign tends to undermine one's God-King aesthetic. Which brings us to the real core of this topic. Discipline, the ancient kind. Not the performative one, where people post about their intermittent fasting while sipping $12 matcha under filtered lighting, but the kind that lets you eat boiled lentils for 3 months without questioning your life choices. Because Alexander's diet was built on continuity, not curation, on what kept you moving, not what made you feel temporarily superior to the peasantry. And if you handed him a kale smoothie, he'd likely assume it was medicine or punishment or both. Because in his world, green drinks meant swamp water or unresolved trauma, not digestive detox. And yet we insist on comparing ourselves to people like him, as if our food choices carry even a fraction of the existential weight his did, which they don't, because no one ever lost an empire over a bad lunch order, but entire kingdoms have been won on flatbread, and whatever didn't give the infantry diarrhea. Which is not to say ancient food was noble, it was usually terrible, but it served a purpose, a clear one, and that purpose was survival, which is something we now only cosplay through boutique camping trips and dehydrated quinoa sachets. And it's telling that modern meals often require footnotes, gluten-free, nut-safe, sustainably sourced, whereas Alexander's meals required only that they didn't slow down his horses or his intestines, because that's what conquest demands. Food that works, not food that philosophizes. And this is why the idea of Alexander sitting in a sushi restaurant, reading about the chef's spiritual connection to seaweed, is historically amusing, but categorically absurd. Because when he did pause to eat, it wasn't about ambience, it was about not dying. And that's the difference. We eat to express ourselves. He ate to keep expressing empire. And this wasn't romantic, it was efficient, which is why he would absolutely lose patience in the modern supermarket, where every aisle is a battlefield of indecision, every product a negotiation between flavor, ethics, and body image, and the sheer volume of choices would read to him not as abundance but as paralysis, a sign that the society no longer knows what it wants or why it eats. only that it wants to optimize its identity through nutrition, and if that sounds like nonsense, it's because it is. And it stands in direct opposition to the food logic of ancient military life, which was not designed to impress but to endure, to fill the stomach while sparing the spirit. And even the so-called feasts, as we've already seen, were just performance rituals draped in roasted meats, not actual indulgences, because Alexander's relationship with food was rooted in restraint, a trained contempt for excess, that today would be labeled unhealthy or ascetic, but was in fact strategic, because you cannot lead armies if you are led by your cravings, and you cannot build an empire if your lunch makes you sleepy, and you definitely don't conquer Persia while counting your macros, which is not to say he never indulged. He did. He drank. He feasted. He once burned a palace during a bender. But these were deviations, not habits, and they usually ended in regret, fire, or history lessons. So when we ask, would Alexander eat this, what we're really asking is how far we've drifted from a world where food was a means, not a mood, where survival was not aestheticized, and where you didn't need a TED Talk to explain why nuts are good for you. And the answer is very far, perhaps too far, because modern menus are built on emotional architecture. Every dish a story, every ingredient a flag, and none of it actually matters to someone trying to cross a desert with 40,000 men and a dream carved into bronze. And if Alexander had a lunch motto, it would not be live, laugh, love. It would be chew, march, repeat. And if that sounds bleak, it's because it was, but it worked. And history tends to remember what works, not what photographs well, which is why ancient menus don't survive except in fragments, while today's menus require full-time design teams and mood boards, and somewhere in that evolution we lost the thread of simplicity, of purpose, of functional discipline, and replaced it with edible theatre, and Alexander would not be impressed. He would be confused, then annoyed, then probably conquer the restaurant out of spite, replace the chef with a supply sergeant, and serve hard cheese with 2 words: eat, walk. And honestly, that might be the most honest dining experience one could have. Brutal, bland, and deeply aware of its place in the machinery of life. Because the ancient world didn't care about your preferences. It cared if you survived long enough to keep building it. And if there's a final lesson here, it's this. Alexander didn't eat for flavor, for identity, for comfort, or for joy. He ate because not eating meant failure, and that's a kind of clarity we've completely abandoned in favor of menu, poetry, and digestible narratives. So next time you ask, would Alexander eat this? Remember, he probably wouldn't, but not because it wasn't organic, but because it didn't get him any closer to Asia, and that was the only flavor he truly craved. Forward.